You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
You're listening to The Special Interviews with your hosts Kerry Greenaway and Andy Mercer, right here on Parasearch Radio.
A good evening and welcome to the Special Interview Show. My name is Kerry Greenaway and I'm joined here tonight by the very lovely Andy Mercer. Good evening, Andy.
Hello there, how are you doing, Joe?
I'm absolutely fine, thank you. Apart from a few tech difficulties, we finally got there, didn't we?
Yes, strange. I mean, I didn't change anything, but we had no voice. I was silent, which most people would be quite happy with, but this time it was not very helpful.
Not particularly helpful at all. Now, tonight we are joined on the Special Interview Show by a leading folklorist and historian, John Kanecko James. Good evening, John. How are you?
Hello, guys. I'm fantastic. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very, very glad to be here. I saw you guys did a show about curses.
Yes.
That sounds really cool because, of course, I certainly saw Andy. I don't remember if I saw you at the Curses conference in Boscastle.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't able to go, I'm afraid. But it was one I was pretty gutted to miss. But that's actually where I wanted to start the show with tonight. So you're very psychic. Because on Friday, now, John, you work at the Globe Theatre in London, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And one of the plays is one of my favourite plays, which is Macbeth.
The Scottish play, yes. The
Scottish play, yes. Now, allegedly, this is the very first question I wanted to ask you, actually, was allegedly Shakespeare used real black magic ritual curses in his work. Is this true, is where I'm going with that?
Oh, God, no. No, absolutely not.
Thank you for clarifying.
No, that's not even one where there's like a discussion and maybe... No, absolutely not. Shakespeare's magic is always a black box. It's always... in fact, it's like Aurak in Blake 7. It's a transparent plot device. It's a thing where you press a button and it advances the plot. So you can, by the way, there are early modern playwrights who put some fairly serious Neoplatonism and magic into their work. So, for example... Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, he does directly quote stuff that is believably magic-ish in the B text, because Faustus has two texts. In the B text, you have this comedy scene where this sort of rude mechanical type gets the book and sort of ignorantly reads out of it. And one of the things that Marlowe writes, either in parody or having seen something like it in a magical book, is that sort of, when I can't remember the character's name, Robin is sort of accidentally summoning the demon Mephistopheles. He goes Mephistopheles, Mephistophelos, Mephistophelon, and that makes Mephistopheles appear. And so my personal opinion is that Marlowe had definitely had a look at magical books. Also, the sort of the reference to how the magical circle looked, the names of God backwards and forwards anagrammatized and all of that stuff. It's very persuasive that I don't think Marlowe was into magic. I do think, though, that he probably took the time to look at a few magical books just to kind of work it out for the sake of technical accuracy. And it's not like he couldn't get his hands on them. They were reasonably available in London if you had a couple of quid. In fact, you didn't have to have a couple of quid. You could have a couple of shillings. You could get something. And also, it's very likely he knew Henry Holland, who was the vicar of St. Bride, and who wrote a book against magic and against witches, and was in the Devereux circle, as I believe Marlowe was. So there are places where he could have easily gotten books. Then you've got John Lilly, who in stuff like Woman in the Moon really has a sort of quite a deep exploration of astrology, but also little bits of sort of what I call Hermetic Kabbalah as well. Because, of course, I like to differentiate between Jewish Kabbalah, which as the central, like a part of their faith, and Kabbalah as we mean when we talk about Western esotericism, which is Hermetic Kabbalah. And so, The Woman in the Moon, it's a fascinating sort of exploration of Hermetic Kabbalah. I mean, it's a bloody awful play. But, well, actually, that's not even true. The most frustrating thing about Woman in the Moon, and I doubt many people here will have heard of it, is that it's really funny. It's a sort of sex comedy. But once he's finished exploring all of the different astrological and sacred things he's interested in, Lily just kind of ends it. It ends really abruptly. It almost ends so abruptly that you'd swear he'd just run out of paper. He'd run out of paper and he's got to give it to a theatre company in the morning, and so it's like, and then she decides who she loves, and that's it.
Sounds like a woman to me.
Well,
just like, that's it done.
Well, that's possible. It might be from his experience, but yeah, literally, it's all this sex comedy, multiple suitors, all the different humors and archetypes being portrayed, etc., etc., and then just abruptly, the woman just turns around and she's like, "Yeah, that one." And funnily enough, chooses the one that makes him most insane.
Okay.
And yes. And so there were early modern playwrights who definitely did sort of have reference to magic. I mean, one of the biggest playwrights for referring to magic is Ben Jonson, who sort of, he was a massive skeptic. I mean, in his private writings, in the plays, his skepticism is absolutely clear. And yet he's the one who writes a play about a devil possessing people. This devil in sort of becomes the servant of a man who's trying to be a ritual magician. He writes, his play, The Alchemist, about sort of the shenanigans that the servants of an alchemist get up to when he's out of town fleeing the plague. And he, in The Alchemist, he explores loads of different aspects of the kind of magical practitioners of the early modern London community. He goes into all the different bits of it. And so, again, he has a massive, highly technical interest in magic. And in his diaries, I already think, it's not his diaries per se, it's some stuff he narrated to a chap called William Drummond, I believe the guy's name was Drummond, as a semi-autobiography. He says he owned a couple of magical books, but they were destroyed in a fire in his rooms. So, again, Jonson was big on his magic. Or at least he was big as a skeptic, and was the kind of skeptic who did read the stuff instead of just condemning it. However, Shakespeare is a writer, and that is it. In the Scottish play, and by the way, I should say why I call it the Scottish play. I personally am actually not superstitious about that, but I work in a theatre, and so I have colleagues who are.
Okay.
Yes. In fact, there is one actor in a show at the moment, and I don't feel that's singling anyone out, because we've got about 9 shows on over the season, and probably about 40 actors. So, and when I say actor, I also mean man or woman. I'm not gendering the word. So it could be any of them.
Okay.
Who, if that word is mentioned while they're in the theatre warming up, will just shake their head and say, no. No. And so that is how deeply superstitious they are about it. And I don't think this person would mind me saying so, but one of the Globe's fight directors, who does a lot of early modern sword fighting and is an expert in specifically sort of 16th, 17th century sword fighting, whenever he teaches a class of actors and students what's going on and like how to do sword fighting, he makes them do a particular charm against bad fortune and evil spirits in case specifically the M word comes up. And so you have this whole lot of young actors, you know, sort of going, angels and ministers of grace protect us, and all of this stuff. So I am not superstitious, however, I have colleagues who are, so I've trained myself not to say the M word when I can help it.
Okay. Well, that kind of answered that question for me, didn't it, about the Macbeth thing? Because
although, there is one interesting thing about Shakespeare's writing of the Scottish play, because, of course, the thing is, he needn't have put actual human witches in it at all, because the Scottish play is a dramatisation of some stuff from Holinshead's Chronicle. And it's one of those weird ones where, because, you know, Andy probably has the same thing, you probably have the same thing. You do talks here and there, and you meet people. And I was at the Rose Playhouse, the archaeological site, who are great people, and they've got a show on at the moment. They've got The Tempest on, by the way, listeners. Great play. Anyway, and I was there doing a lecture, and I did a lecture about the Scottish play, and I was talking about how in Hall, you know, it was taken from Holinshead. And this particular lady, a wonderful friend of mine, Anne Rowley, sort of stood up and said in the audience, have you read Holinshead's Chronicle? And I sort of said, well, I've looked up the quotes. She said, oh, would you like to read my copy? And I thought, oh, that's very sweet. Oh, she's going to show me like her printed copy or something. And we met at the Globe's Cafe, and she has an original second edition of Holinshead Chronicle. Wow. And in that, and it might be in other versions, but I've only, and this sounds really pretentious, but I've only read the 1576 original. But in that edition, the witches in the story of King Macbeth, they are not witches, they are fairies or creatures of the elder world. And that's how they're described. And so when and it's an odd set of choices Shakespeare makes in the Scottish play, because he turns the fairies into witches, human women, but then he doesn't show the devil. He kind of just a little bit kind of wusses out of showing the devil. And so it's an interesting set of choices that he makes in that play. So anyway, that's my answer to that. Anyway.
Why do you think he did that? Why? Because looking at the time that he wrote that, why do you think he made that choice?
Well, my personal theory is that he was being, well, both topical and flattering to King James the First. You see, some of the things he does in the play, I think it's Act 1.3 specifically, he makes the most references. He references some stuff that had happened to James many years before Shakespeare wrote the Scottish play, because back in, well, it's a series of events between 1589 and 1591 in Scotland, the North Berwick witch trials. And James got personally involved. This poor woman got dragged in, Agnes Sampson, and got dragged in and interrogated by the sort of Presbyterian Kirk at Haddington. And during the whole thing, she mentioned James the First's troubles. He was James the Sixth, really, but that's another story. James the Sixth's troubles with his wife, because he had married Anne of Denmark, but storms kept on giving her problems with her boat, and so she had trouble getting to Scotland. And this poor woman, Agnes Sampson, mentions that, she predicts that the only way the king will ever get his wife back, his wife at all, really, because she was just a very posh mail-order bride, and the only way he'll ever, but the only way he'll ever get her is if he goes and fetches her personally from Denmark. And, of course, that then plays out because James is starting to look bad. He's starting to really embarrass himself because, he's sitting in Edinburgh overlooking the sea writing poems and she's not turning up. And so he goes over there. He spends a few months in Denmark. He meets Tycho Brahe, the astrologer and things. And then they come back. And after that, it kicks off this terrible witch trial that just keeps ballooning. And sort of it takes in all of these people then who are supposed to be in this plot to basically either... At first it just starts out there trying to just delay the wedding. Then it transpires that they were trying to take magical control over James. Then it goes on further. They confess that the devil and the Earl of Bothwell, who is his rival, were trying to kill James. And James gets personally involved and interrogates them. And it just becomes this bloodbath with all these people. It's quite a number of them. It's about 12 plus people who get killed. And it sparks this whole thing of witch hunting that goes in waves in Scotland for about a decade after. And it all got published in a pamphlet called News from Scotland. And that pamphlet was reasonably popular in London. I'm in the process. I'm intending soon to check the stationer's register to try and see its exact reach and see how many times it was reprinted and things. But it was reasonably well known and popular, and the story was well known. And James was a man who was fairly well known for celebrating his triumphs. And so he had a yearly personal celebration of the Ruthven Raid, which was where a bunch of people sort of kidnapped him and tried to take control of the country. I mean, heck, the ultimate sign of James I's triumphalism in Britain is that we have a thing called Guy Fawkes Night. And, that's a sign of how he was a man who liked his triumphs. And the Scottish witch trials, the North Berwick witch trials, they were not only his perceived triumph over the forces of Satan and sort of showing himself as the king, but also the true representative of God on earth. But also they were a bit of a personal triumph because it was the thing that set in motion the series of events that allowed him to triumph over the Earl of Bothwell, who was his chief kind of rival to the throne. And so I think that the reason he made that Shakespeare made those choices was because he wanted to stroke James's ego a little. And that's why Banquo in the Scottish play is a bit more heroic than Banquo in Holinshead. Because Banquo in Holinshead is really kind of not really that much of a hero. He's just this guy, basically. Whereas Banquo in, Macbeth, the play, which I shouldn't have said, but anyway, is sort of... he's a bit more heroic and a bit more against all the bad guy stuff. And so, yeah, he was just trying to flatter James, but I think he didn't want to go too far and actually have the devil represented on stage.
Okay.
There is a concern of just going a bit too far.
That's a step too far. Now, one of the things you do look into is the influence of fairy imagery on the witch trials, isn't it?
Absolutely, I do. Oh, definitely. And it's an interesting one with the fairies because they were a huge image through society. I mean, I've looked at, it's about 240 early modern pamphlets featuring fairies for everything from books about the supernatural to plays to poems, all kinds of stuff. There were the two big peaks. The first one being in the 1590s, the second one being, I think it was the 1610s. And there were these two big spikes of publication. But yes, there was, I think it's fair to say there's evidence of a sort of general pervasive fairy worship through England. Not an organised cult in any way, but there were lots and lots in plenty of different areas of Britain of people who felt the fairies existed, who felt that they were in touch with the fairies, and who might have even claimed or believed, and we can never know belief, that's the thing you can't measure, but who certainly claimed that they had some special relationship with the fairies. And you see that in the southeast of England, you see it in the southwest, you certainly see it in Scotland, because James actually remarks on that in his book Demonology, his book on basically the supernatural.
I'm just actually typing an answer to a question of around that in the chat room as we speak, so carry on.
Lovely.
The witchcraft. We covered it briefly on Friday about James destroying that book, even though Reg Scott himself wasn't a believer in witchcraft or magic, but he collected lots of spells and incantations that were around at the time. And James didn't like the idea of existing in a book, so had it burned. So as you know, it's an incredibly rare book now. Worth absolute fortunes if you can find a copy, because there's not many left.
Ah, really? Is this Reginald Scott's?
Yeah, absolutely. The original, the first edition, of course, there's not a vast amount in there, but the later edition, the third edition, is one that's got a huge collection of spells, charms, and incantations in the back of it that were added by an hitherto unknown additional author. But certainly James had that burnt, and his own book about witchcraft was made very much public to try and ensure that people did not get involved in witchcraft practices.
Oh, Lord, yes. Definitely. I mean, well, this was the thing. I mean, poor old Reginald Scott, God bless him. He was a witchcraft skeptic, but he did actually, and Johannes Virus did something similar to some extent.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they both publicised all this stuff that they were trying to debunk.
So often the case, though, isn't it? You think about also with John Dee and Merrick Casaubon publishing True Relation, Dee's diaries, trying to debunk and say he was a charlatan taken in by a fool, yet preserved all the diaries for the later diaries. And of course, as you said, the demon hierarchies, all listed by Verus, also remain available. Even though these guys are actually working to actually debunk this material, they nevertheless preserved it for us, which is quite nice of them, thankfully.
Oh, God, yeah. Well, it's the same with the fairy tradition to some extent. I mean, I don't want to call it a fairy faith, and calling it fairy tradition sort of feels a bit woo, but it's what it is. It's a fairy tradition. And, you know, I mean, my particular hobby horse is the Rye Trial of 1607, which is we've got a huge amount of information about it, and people are always amused when I describe it. One person, that Mark Norman of the Folklore Society and of Circle of Spears and that sort of thing, Sorry,
we had him on the show a few weeks ago, Mark.
Mark's a lovely guy. He's a good guy. And I came up in one of his interviews, and the person interviewing him was really amused that I measured the volume of the Rye Trial in words, because I've got 40,000 words of transcription from the one trial, and it's the reason that is worth saying is because I'm sure, Andy and Kerry, you've read witch trials. They're usually tiny. Yeah. If you've got a couple of pages, that's significant, usually. Mm-hmm. Most of them are lines. Most of them are about 2 lines, because, as I said, well, certainly I did a survey of the Surrey Assizes a couple of years ago, and it's like and in fact, there's one whole big period of about 10 years where I don't think I found a single trial of a witch that was more than 2 lines. Mm. And this is a prosecution document. And at the British Library, which I haven't had a chance to look at yet, there's another lengthy prosecution document. There's a pack of letters, which is about 13 letters long. Mm-hmm. And so we could be talking a single trial that could give us a book-length amount of stuff about what people were talking and saying about witches at the time.
Yeah.
Well, it would be quite amazing, considering what we normally have available. It's so scant, so absolutely fascinating.
This is the thing, and this is why it's interesting, because as you say, these people are hostile. They're not anthropologists, they're not folklorists, but the things they are recording as they're doing their work is significant. And the great Marianne Gibson of Exeter University, she actually wrote a whole book, Reading the Witch Trial, on the various ways in which you have to be cautious when you read a witch trial, which is totally fair, because you are looking through the prosecutor's eye. Or if it's a pamphlet, you're looking through a journalist's eye, essentially. But it's still fascinating because it gives you this image of these two women, and one of them, a woman called Anna Taylor, she is not what you think of when you think of a woman doing magic in the 17th century. She is what I would describe as a doctor. She makes chemical tinctures. She bases them upon astrology. She can chart the path of an illness as an illness. And so there's a bit where she gets accused of witchcraft because the mayor gets sick and somebody says, oh, I wonder if he'll get better. And she sort of says, nope, he's got so-and-so, and this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen. And it does. And that goes into her prosecuting document, because obviously if she was able to sort of, to predict the path of the illness, then that shows there's something wrong, that she did it. But they had an altar to the fairies in a room in their house, in the attic. And they used to make offerings to it. And that's just not the kind of detail that you see anywhere else. And the kind of altar that's described, it's not the sort of thing where you'd say, oh, well, they're just making it up. So if it was, oh, yes, we all had a Sabbath and we all got naked and rubbed ourselves in rancid grease and then sort of, and then we all did sort of, we touched the devil's what's-it and all of that, which they, all of this, by the way, if anyone's listening, goes back to a chap kind of called Conrad of Marburg, who basically just had a fixation on bums. And he wrote this description of the antics of heretics. And by the fourth round of anal sex, he describes, you do just wish he'd get it out of his system. But that's not what they describe in the Rye trial. In the Rye trial, what they describe is just a very sort of small, respectful altar in the attic, and they take up flowers to it, and they take up these tinctures of astrologically significant water, and, well, by water they just mean a liquid chemical suspension, and they place that on the altar, and so it gives us an interesting thing into the fairy tradition.
Obviously, it's also worth mentioning that what fairies are in that sort of time frame, how they're seen compared to what we might see today, because we're not quite talking about the same kind of thing, are we?
Oh, Lord, no. They are not like the sort of post-Victorian fairies, the cute fairies at the bottom of the garden. And there is a tendency for people, by the way, to go way the other way and say, yes, they're dark and evil, they are terrible, and that's not quite true either. The fairies are so much like us, and they're only separated from us by the thinnest of veils. Yeah. They are walking amongst us by the belief of this period. They're walking amongst us. Their homes are amongst us. They look like us. They can have sex with us. Andrew Mann, the Scottish sorcerer done for witchcraft, describes a really sexual and tumultuous relationship with the Queen of the Fairies. But the thing with the fairies is that they are so capricious and so powerful and so easily offended, if I may say so from historical record.
I love being careful there.
There we go, yes. Hell, you never know, and it's good not to offend people needlessly.
This is true.
But that they are, because of that, dangerous. Because, of course, someone that powerful and that, not unstable, but passionate, is very dangerous to be around. And that's the thing with the fairies. They'll give you all those gifts and then, for the slightest offence, take them away again. And there's one interesting diary of it's a chap, Goodwin Wharton. And I've just read a book about him thanks to the amazing Dr. Al Cummins in the US, who was one of the speakers, as you might remember.
Yeah, absolutely. Good bloke.
Lovely chap. And hello to all the others I met through him as well. And he sort of put me onto this book about a chap, Goodwin Wharton. And he was sort of with this woman, Mary Parish, and they together had this shamanistic magical practice with the fairies and with angel magic. And it's one of the things, whereas we as modern people have this almost pathological disease where we like to separate traditions, for them it was very much a melting pot. And for them, there was no cognitive dissonance in having a bit of fairy shamanism going on, and whether she was conning him or not, because Mary was sort of a middle-class woman who sort of had fallen on hard times, and Goodwin was a lesser nobleman. And there is a suggestion by one author that she was just basically stringing him along. But whether or not that was the case, you know, she had this deep relationship with the fairies, but saw no problem with also having a deep relationship with angel magic and doing sort of visionary work with the angels and doing grimoire magic to contact angels and having her angel shrine where she did the magic and that sort of thing. But she would have this deep relationship with the fairies where they would go and they would swing from extreme sort of adulation to cutting her off to kind of drawing them back in again. And they were very much in the everyday lives of the people who seemed to believe in them. So, yes.
Okay, well, we have had a question in the chat room by Richard Clements. He says, during this time period, how was it said the fairies manifested themselves?
Now, this is an interesting one, because they look like just quite rich, usually quite good-looking or terribly ugly humans. And that's the other thing about fairies. They are so like us. I think Mary Parish's descriptions are a little bit, if my memory serves me right, more like what we might think of as fairy, because I think she describes them as being kind of shorter than humans. But most of them just look like posh people, basically. Not too posh, though. Not ridiculous, because when people describe fairies appearing, if you look at the colour palette they describe, it's usually colours that were a little bit nice. So like really good rich greens and whites and maybe a little bit of black, but never the colours that they could have talked about. Never gold, never red, or at least not that I've ever seen. And so, yes, fairies were very much, they were like us, but not us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it tended to be those kind of rural colours, that almost as if it was all made from material from the forest, and that rather than anything was bright and loud and scary, wasn't it? It was that kind of, almost as if they're still part of the landscape, but yet still to be ordinary human beings. That's
the thing. And I mean, and those colour palettes as well, those are the colour palettes that these people would have seen worn by their relatively well-off neighbours.
Mm-hmm.
So the big people in their community would have been wearing those colours, because that's, what it was legal for them to wear. There was a concept in the early modern period of sumptuary laws. And so there were laws that, I mean, they weren't always kind of rigidly enforced, but they did exist. That if you wore certain colours outside of your station, you could be prosecuted, you could be fined, you could be technically jailed. But also, certain colours, to some extent, wouldn't even have been in somebody's regular sort of life experience if they didn't live in the right area. And so the other thing about these colours they are the colours of the posh people for the communities that see them as well. But yes, and the other thing about fairies, by the way, is that they, of course, appear as the dead, or at least in some belief systems, it would seem that the dead can become fairies.
Yeah.
That if the right ceremonies, if the right sort of prayers are not said over you when you die, that you can sort of be nabbed and turned into a fairy after death. And you also get this thing of women who practice this sort of quite visionary fairy magic. They have a particular fairy guide who is a dead person with some connection to them. So either a relative or a friend of a relative who's respected and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, my goodness. This is a whole new world for me. I'm not going to lie.
I think in some respects we can transpose those ideas into what a lot of modern thinkers think about, of course, about ghosts, the way they appear to act. So the phenomenon of the otherworldly being is obviously is recognised now, of course, is very old anyway, but it's taken different forms in different times. I mean, obviously Victorians and going back to Elizabethan times had concepts of ghosts as well, but the otherworldly beings is almost parallel or mirroring, of course, our modern idea of supposed alien beings and landed spacecraft and strange appearances of people out in the wild, as it were. Because they never, of course, appear in the middle of London. It's always somewhere out in the wild you see these UFO beings, of course, as you would be with these sort of creatures, those kind of distant woods and far off lands. So you'd have to be out in the countryside and often on your own to witness these sorts of things. So
yes.
Yeah. There is a definite evolution, isn't there, through the ages where the belief systems you can see it change and evolve in how people perceive things. There is definitely an evolution.
Yeah. Oh, crumbs, yes. Oh, Lord, yes. And yes, no, Andy, you're absolutely right. And there is an interesting thing going on in that period, in the early modern period, where, to some extent, people are fighting for the ghost. There are these different philosophical ideas, and they're having a tug of war over what the idea of a ghost is.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have, like, what I would sort of call your sort of grassroots folkloric community, who, for them, the ghost is perhaps the fairy ghost, if you know what I mean, as I've just talked about. The ghost is maybe a little like the Revenant, or the ghost is a disembodied spirit, if you know what I mean. Yeah. But then you have the Puritan, for whom the ghost can only be a demon in human form. The ghost is not a kind of a real dead person, because as far as the Puritans, and that's a real misattribution, by the way, because it suggests Puritans were a monolithic body, and they weren't. They were not at all monolithic until very late in their existence. But the Puritans, the Church of England, the Protestants, for all of them, the ghost was a totally demonic entity. And then, you have the Catholics, of course, for whom the dead are these benevolent figures who can be prayed to, who can intercede on our behalf, and who, when they are troublesome, can be evicted and exorcised.
Andy?
That's quite a different definition of those ideas that we'd have today. I mean, the last you were just talking about there very briefly, I was interviewing a friend of mine for a different show on voodoo. And, of course, the Catholic idea of the reverent of the dead and possibly bringing them back as household spirits is something you do find in voodoo. I don't mean, obviously, zombies, but I mean the idea of that some sort of the lower spirits can actually be your own relatives who passed away and they become more sort of powerful post-life. So that kind of idea is there again. But also going back to you saying before about Christianity, generally speaking, not just Puritans, but Christianity overall would reject the idea of a ghost being anything other than demonic force, because it's clearly in the Bible it's pretty much stated the ghosts don't exist as ghosts. They are demons in other forms. So it is one of those things we have now of quite a clear-cut idea of what we think, and I often refer to the Victorian notion of ghost, and that's the only notion of ghost that we seem to use these days. But just saying quite rightly there, before that time there were lots of different definitions that weren't necessarily compatible with each other even. There were quite different ideas about them.
Oh, Lord, yes. And I mean, the English Revenant it's my favourite type of ghost. And it is so alien to us. I mean, it's this thing that can shapeshift and is physically very powerful, that can in some myths alter its density, to become heavier or lighter, that is very intelligent, is articulate, is capable of making deals with humans, but also, whereas, the Victorian O. Henry turning of the screw ghost will drive you mad or kill you via a fairly ill-defined methodology. The English Revenant will kill you in the same way that a bloke on the street will kill you. He will find you alone in a dark place and just beat you up. And but very often, but after first turning into a succession of utterly, utterly bizarre creatures and objects. So you might be riding your horse down the road, and suddenly this burning crow will come down at you that will then turn into a hay bale with a fiery eye at the middle of it, that will then turn, I think it was a goat next, or maybe a bipedal horse, and that will then finally turn into an old man who will explain to you that he's a ghost. And in that particular story, which is from the Bylands manuscript, a wonderful manuscript of ghost stories from the north of England, in the Bylands manuscript as well, they describe one really terrifying ghost who is a human being, but because of his crimes and sins, he has been condemned to spend his death as a black bull with no eyes or ears, just a mouth and a head. And so this terrifying, utterly smooth sort of, head on a black bull. And that's creepy. I don't know if that just gets me or if anyone else has the same feeling. But yes.
Well, it kind of fits in the modern definition of a demon, of course. This kind of strange powers and transformations and controlling people, all that kind of thing. We now just lump into this big category of demon and leave it at that. But I think if you mention that description of reverent ghosts to your average paranormal investigator, they would have a clue what you were talking about, because it's an old idea, an old tradition, which has pretty much disappeared and it's been kind of carved up into other areas, sort of shifted away to anything that appears to be supposedly non-human must therefore be by definition demonic, which is really sad.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, the perception in sort of modern paranormal investigating of what a ghost is, it's very post-Victorian, and sort of, I'm very cautious to comment on these things for the simple reason, right, that I make no secret. After about 1650, Martians could have ruled the Earth and I wouldn't know. But, if they buggered off before about 1982, when I have sort of my sort of first detailed memories, then do you know what? I wouldn't be any the wiser. But, when you look at paranormal investigation, it's got a very Victorian attitude to the ghost. But I think that is because, and please tell me I'm wrong if this is incorrect, a lot of modern paranormal investigating revolves in one way or another around Victorian spiritualism.
That's certainly the basis by which most so-called investigations take place, using the preconceived notions and the criteria that we've added in modern equipment like your various apps for phones you have these days, camcorders, audio equipment, etc. But the basic premise of the nature of what they're supposedly investigating has hardly changed since the spiritualism came into being in the late Victorian period. It's not really moved beyond that. I often say that before programs like Most Haunted, it was evolving, it moved forward, but they took very much that kind of Victorian parlour ghost notion into the 20th century. It was then when it first started, back in 1999, I think it was. But they took everything back to that kind of style of investigating that had, by and large, disappeared. It was very much... It's what works for TV, and unfortunately what works for TV rarely works in the real world, and that is one of the problems we are very much still stuck with. There's a whole series of notions about how investigation is supposed to take place and the kind of thing you're supposed to encounter that have been not even expanded upon. They've been reinforced in many cases that this is the way these things are supposed to work. This is how it's supposed to happen. How dare you possibly question that might be wrong? You do something which is the people from a whole set of ideas and beliefs which they bring into their investigating, and lo and behold, they find things that seem to fit the criteria. But as I say, if the kind of reverend ghost you're talking about now, if we were to experience that in an investigation, people will start screaming demon straight away, particularly if they're a fan of the American TV shows, because that's all they talk about, as we often mention on our shows over here.
Really? I didn't know that. This is my sort of being a bit sheltered from that stuff, but I suppose it's because in the Victorian era, the spiritualists dominated the dialogue, because everybody seems to have been in one of two relationships, either pro or against. But even if you are against them, they are still dominating the dialogue, because you're debunking them, and therefore you're attacking their dialogue. But it's a shame if Most Haunted has done that. My only comment about Most Haunted, because I don't want to start anything controversial, is that they did a special in my hometown of Llanelli. Now, I am taking off my hat as a historical researcher here, but there are certain ghost stories about the buildings they went to that, in my opinion, you could sit in any decent old pub in Llanelli and you could say, do you know any ghost stories? And you'd be told those stories. It's a big town, by the way. Llanelli has, when I last looked, it had something like 140,000 inhabitants, which is kind of, I believe that's similar in size to Croydon or something. But it's still a town where those are the stories that are told. And so I was really surprised. I suppose I was really innocent as well. That sort of I sat down with my friends to watch the Most Haunted Llanelli live. And they managed not to mention a single ghost story that I had ever heard.
That doesn't sound at all surprising. I won't retell the whole story again now, but I actually attended one of their first live shows at Woodchester Mansion, and they managed to relocate ghosts. Ghosts that had been seen in a particular part of the building which they couldn't access for reasons I'm not talking about now, but they couldn't get to, suddenly materialised for the first time ever in a different part of the building where they've never been seen before. And that seemed a little strange to me, as in, let's manipulate what's available, make use of it that way. So that doesn't surprise me at all, John. It really doesn't.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. And by the way, the biggest reason, both as a researcher and a storyteller, and even as somebody who is sometimes an entertainer, it annoys me, is because the ghosts they used were crap. If you're going to use a ghost, we have a wonderful white lady in Llanelli at Park Howard Mansion, which is a beautiful Italianate little, quite compact mansion house in a beautiful park, right? And it's this white lady because, in the First World War you had the idea of PALS regiments.
Yeah.
Well, they were terrible for this exact reason, because of course all of her husband, I think the story is, and all her sons joined up as officers in the Llanelli PALS regiment, and they all went into this meat grinder that was the First World War. Mm-hmm. And they all got killed. And basically, she locked herself in the tower and never came out again. And so they say that, if you're in the grounds, you might look up into the tower and see a woman there in white, and that is the White Lady. And one of my brother's friends when I was growing up, because I was kind of brought up by my brother, and one of his brother's friends had been a gardener at this mansion. And so as a punishment, he was made to go up into the tower room, because what it was actually full of was all of the family's treasures, like everything they brought back from their travels over like 200 years. And so every so often somebody had to go up there and clean everything. And it was this beautiful, and the whole thing's now a museum because of this collection, by the way. And basically, he was up there polishing assegai from Africa and dusting off hide shields, and he was cleaning this collection of conductors' batons that looked very cool and magic wand-like. And he was talking to himself. And when he came down, one of the others was like, "Who are you talking to?" And he said, "Oh, I was talking to that woman." Just to take the piss, obviously. And he was just like, "Oh, yeah, I was talking to that woman who's always up there. And, yeah, she's nice." And, the other guy probably turned white and literally just ran out of the whole park. you know. And these stories, and there's another great one about a sort of a dissolute 19th century industrialist's son who got the maid pregnant and she hanged herself in front of his bedroom window. There's the story in Park Howard Mansion where they did The Most Haunted Life, where during the night, during World War I, when it was a fever hospital, an entire room full of wounded soldiers from World War One. Sorry, not a fever hospital. It was a hospital for soldiers coming back from First World War. And an entire room of soldiers saw an entire group of Vikings charge through the room.
Excellent.
Now, obviously that can't be a ghost for the simple reason I don't think there were any Vikings that far south in Britain, or at least that far southwest. But
Where exactly?
Llanelli it's very far southwest in Wales. It's
in your home. Right. No, that wouldn't make sense at all.
But if there were Romans, it would work, but not Vikings.
There were raiding parties throughout the whole coast. They did actually wander around. They got as far as Ireland as well. So
it's possible then. But either way, I mean, these are great stories, and I can't remember what the stories they actually told were, but they were unbelievably weak. You know.
Well, we've got a question in the chat room from Ashley Nibb. He says, is it possible that a...
Sorry, to that, because that's more my field than John think about it.
Okay. Sorry. Carry on, Andy. Because and let me tell everybody what the question is, who might be listening and not in the chat room. Said, is it possible that a return to some more ritualistic processes may help us to discover more about the paranormal world? Now, I'm not talking about dark magic approaches, but processes that can help focus intent beliefs and faith in order to better connect with the supernatural.
Well, if we're going to have a medium, I don't see why we can't have a necromancer.
There is not a lot of difference, John, to be perfectly honest. There really isn't. And you tell the average medium that, and they tend to get a bit loopy at you, but there's not a vast difference. And necromantic activity tends more to do with manipulation and getting them to do something for you. But the general beginning point of communication, absolutely, there's no difference at all. And when you want to use a ritual invocation at locations, I've seen that happen with disastrous consequences. I've also seen it happen and cause amazing consequences. But so it's something that it very much is dependent on your own intent, the nature of the place you're working in, and the nature of what it is you want to achieve. I mean, don't just mean by intent, I mean what your mindset is and what you're looking to achieve aren't necessarily the same thing. So I have seen very odd things happen at locations that I know full well that ritual activity have taken place, very unpleasant things happening at locations, and it is a case that you can walk into the atmosphere and environment actually and you can feel it. There's no two ways about it. You cannot escape from the sense that something here is not right at all. Just very briefly, just to highlight the point, I did an investigation, many investigations at the Galleries of Justice in Nottingham, and there is a lot of areas that are very active and some are not so active. But one of the most active areas is the ladies' bathroom and changing rooms, which is, let's say it's Victorian, so it's not like a modern setup at all. It's quite difficult to see it now. There was activity of many kinds. You get this often, obviously, a feeling of a female presence, etc. But on this one particular occasion, we walked into the room, and the room itself just did not feel right at all. It felt very uncomfortable, very unpleasant. It was hard to really put your finger on, but it just, from the previous visits we'd had there, it just didn't feel the same at all. There's something quite wrong about it. We carried on the investigation as normal, and nothing really much actually happened, other than the fact that a lot of people felt uncomfortable and sick, which no one had ever previously experienced in that room. Later in the evening, I'd just have a quick chat with the security guy who's on guard, who's on patrol all night. He's in his little hut, but he's there if you need to get hold of him. And I said to him, do you know anything about what happened here last night? Because this was a Saturday night, and our investigations most Fridays and Saturdays. And he said, in a nutshell, yes, we had a group in who've not been before. And when I was doing my rounds after they'd left, I found what looks like the remains of candles in one of the rooms. And I thought that was very odd, and we don't usually allow candles to be burnt, and then I have to report this to the management. And I said, is it the ladies' changing room by any chance? He said, yes, how did you know? Because I cleaned it all up. So there was no doubt about it. Something had gone on with this group, some kind of activity. The candles had been left, and it was just the way he spoke. It wasn't as if it was like, oh, a couple of candles just left burning. It was like candles are left around, like something had definitely been going on. So this group, so he didn't say who they were, but they clearly had done stuff that they weren't supposed to, and it clearly had an effect on that particular room in the galleries. So, yeah, definitely people do use these things, but whether they know exactly what they're doing is another matter entirely.
Well, that's interesting, because, I mean, we're very lucky at the moment. We're undergoing this renaissance of grimoire rediscovery and that sort of thing, and people doing living grimoire practices. But I remember reading something, I think it was David Rankin wrote, and this was a while ago, it must have been 10 years ago, where he was sort of writing at how, and I hate bashing the Victorians, but I'm going to do it again, that sort of well, they're not my period, so, you know. But anyway, the post-Victorian ritual magic sort of neglected the significance of things like the license to depart.
Yes.
For example, so if you're going to do something with the spirit, you don't just invoke, you don't just do the invocation and then your conversation and then you close your circle. You have to license it to depart, and most licenses to depart you see usually are sort of quite strict in how the spirit leaves. So it's like leave without causing any fuss or trouble, leave without making a sound, don't hang around, don't mess with any machines, etc. And it's an interesting one where you can see, I mean, even in my period, Dr. Simon Foreman in his diaries... Oh, yeah. Right, yeah, you probably know this incident, writes about how he did summon a spirit, and it all seems to have gone a bit tits up, and it stays around for days, messing with the servants and blocking the flue so that soot comes back down and smoke comes back down the flues, etc., etc. And so, yeah, if you don't do everything properly, it is, going to be a problem. But... Absolutely. I'm a big believer in ritual. I reckon it could be a good innovation, particularly now we've got better education than we've had before.
Well, as long as it is people who are on the investigation who really do know what they're doing, for these very reasons, we can get a long debate about the nature of what you're dealing with, absolutely, but there is something there that we are dealing with. The way you define a ghost or whatever entity term you prefer, you're dealing with a something or other, and you are upsetting and disturbing these something or others if you start poking around. But if you're asking very specific questions in a very specific way, then you're liable to get a good response. I mean, just a little quick parallel here. It is important to do things properly in the right way, as you know, John, as you talked before, I've written about Enochian magic, and my book's out on Enochian magic, and it's often been said to me, why do we use this very strange Enochian language? Why don't we just speak to them in English? To which I say, and it's a quote from somebody else, I must admit, but I do think it's a very good one. If you were sitting in your lounge at home and a little mouse walks along and sits on your foot and starts squeaking at you, you'd probably think, oh, bloody mouse, well, the mouse got in the house, oh yeah. If the mouse gets on your foot and starts speaking English to you, I think you'd pay attention, wouldn't you?
I like that.
Take notice. But the thing is, we are the mice. The thing being spoken to is something far bigger than us.
Oh, I totally agree.
It's like Milo Duquette, the famous American writer who came up with that quote. And I've read it years ago, and I've always loved it. It's pretty true. But I think if you want to use that approach, it's like having a very bright light that's shining towards these guys, saying, come on, guys, come and join us and talk to us. We're here. You ritual magic, you're using a much brighter, much more powerful light to say, come and chat with us. So it has to be done properly, and you're absolutely right. If you're going to invoke in that particular way, you need to be able to dispel as well and get through and across the notion that fundamentally you are in control. You are the one carrying out the ritual. You're the one saying, I'm in control, and you do what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you nicely, but you'll do what I'm asking you to do, and you'll go when I ask you to go. Is telling you to go the right way, and they can come back and say, well, you didn't tell me the right way to go, I'm staying. So it has to be done very properly.
Well, do you know the quote from Graham Bond, the musician, who, as you might know, got into his kind of Golden Dawn flavoured Hermeticism, and he released a CD called Holy Magic. Well, not a CD, sorry, that's maybe being anachronistic. A record of called Holy Magic, which included the lesser banishing of the pentagram ritual and a couple of really good things. But he reportedly had a conversation with David Farrant of Highgate, where sort of he came into David, and this isn't something David told me, I should stress, by the way. I read this in an archived version of NME. But anyway, sort of, because I have met and kind of know David, but this isn't a conversation I had with David. And basically, anyway, so we went to see David one day, and David sort of said, "Graham, you look awful. What's wrong with you?" And he sat down and said, "I've been doing too much invoking and not enough banishing."
Yes.
And yeah. But the thing with ritual magic is, I think you'd get something much more often. As you say, it's a brighter light to shine. However, you'll get something much more often, and that is the double-edged sword. Because to some extent, with mediumship, the most you'll get with incompetent mediumship, unless you're very unlucky, is nothing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you can really screw it up as well. I'm sure it's very equal opportunities, and people are able to mess things up just as badly as each other. But a lot of the time, from the few paranormal investigations I've been on, I think with mediumship, when it doesn't go right, you get nothing. Whereas I think with ritual magic, although I'd still love to see it, I think this would be a great thing to have a go at, but still, if it goes wrong, you'll still get something.
Yes.
Which could be the problem. But of course, I have had, because you were saying that there's something out there and we don't have to define it here, and I agree, but during my fairies research, I had, and I've spoken of it on a couple of other podcasts, I had my unexplained experience. I was in the basement of the London Library, which is not the British Library, as you might know. It's a private members' library in St James's. And I was down there digging through, because they've got a massive collection of Victorian periodicals. Okay. And these periodicals are very useful because they did things like going through the assize trials and just ripping out, shall we say, an entire year's trials and publishing it for their periodical, and sort of going, and here are all of the 1591 trials of Aberdeen. And so they're very useful. And I was going through, and I kind of stood up to get another book, and there was this man about sort of 3-4 feet in front of me, and he was blonde, he had blue eyes, he was wearing a suit that my opinion is it was Victorian, but I'm not a tailor or that kind of historian, but it didn't look Edwardian, it looked too sort of old-fashioned to be Edwardian. So I think he was wearing a Victorian suit. And for a split second, we just looked at each other, and it was this look. It wasn't a look of, woo, I'm a ghost. It was this look of, what the hell are you doing here? And we gave each other this look, and then he vanished in front of my eyes. And I must admit...
Interesting.
Yeah. And when I saw him, by the way, my thought was not at all, I am having a paranormal experience. My thought was, oh, Christ, they're filming. I'm going to be moved on. Because they do film things in the London Library all the time. It loads of things get filmed there. And so I was like, oh, for fuck's sake. It's sorry.
So it's not live. I can edit it out. Oh no, I can't. Sorry.
It is live. We can't edit it out. It's all right. I've marked it as explicit. It's fine. Carry on.
I've done what's described as a Joan Rivers, like when she went on Loose Women and dropped the F-bomb because she didn't realise it was live. You'll cut to commercial and then I'll be gone, replaced by a coffee cup. No, anyway.
No, as I say, we were marked as explicit, so it's absolutely fine. It's no problem. One thing I would like to ask, sorry, lads, to cut in.
I know, I'm not going to let you, because I want to come back to something that John said I think is really important.
Okay, go on then.
To talk about. You said it was a dual recognition, as if he saw you and thought, what are you doing here?
Yes, totally. We were looking at each other.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because we're not talking about, the old notion of the stone tape, the residual replay. We're talking about something that's active and communicating. Almost, and I always hate to use that phrase, it always sounds so naff to me, but time slip. Almost that kind of area of, whoa, dual two-way recognition. Each recognises the other ones in the place they shouldn't be. That's fascinating.
Yep, I totally agree with you, because everybody I've spoken to has raised that, and it's what I thought of myself more than a ghost, because he was as surprised to see me as I was to see him. Mm-hmm. And as I say, the best way to describe it is just as I was turning around and seeing him there and thinking, oh God, what is this guy going to do? Am I going to be moved on? It was as if he had left all his stuff on that desk I was standing by, and he'd walked around the corner, and there was this weird bloke with long hair and this kind of strange glowing rectangle with a metal edge on the desk, for a moment.
Could you imagine finding some Victorian diary describing this strange-looking individual with curly hair carrying this tablet of light? Can you imagine what it would be like if you found that Victorian diary with that entry in? It would be
my God.
Wouldn't it? It would be absolutely incredible.
That would be one of those big things. Do you know what I mean? That would be, huge. Yes. Well, if I ever find any diaries of people who lived in that building, because the one fun thing about the London Library is it's not a purpose-built building. What the London Library did is they had one building that they bought, and then they sort of they expanded into the private houses around that one building. And when they took them over, what they did is they just knocked all the floors and ceilings out. And so as you're going around the London Library, you're going from one private house to another private house. And they left in the bare minimum of supporting walls and put in their own floors, which are these amazing kind of metal scaffolds. And if you look down them, you can see 3 levels down, and it vanishes into darkness. And I'm always worried about dropping my phone in it. So it probably was someone's private house, or if he was late Victorian, it could have been the library. And so that would be stunning. Now, sorry, Kerry, what was your question?
Going back to, we were talking about rituals and plays and stuff like that, thought patterns going on over here. So there are power in words.
Yes.
In regards to the plays you referenced earlier on, right at the beginning of the interview, bear with me on this because, say, thought patterns are going on in my brain. I'm trying to connect dots that are probably not going to connect, but they might. When you have a play that has these references and these connotations in them, and you have power in words, does that relate into any experiences that happen whilst these plays are playing? Does that make sense?
Well, there is a story. It's a very interesting recurrent urban myth, and that makes me sound much grander than I am. I found an academic journal article that had tracked this particular story to its origin point. But basically, it was a recurring story about the play Dr. Faustus, where basically, during the middle scene of Dr. Faustus, there's this kind of pivotal scene where the devil comes on stage and he parades the 7 vices for Faustus to tempt him, into being the devil's thrall properly, fully, and without any reservations. And there's this recurring story, and my favourite version of it takes place at the Rose Playhouse, which is where Faustus was done for the first time. And my favourite version of it is with an actor called Edward Alleyne. And the story goes that Alleyne was a massive egotist, and he always insisted on playing Dr. Faustus himself. And so, one day he was being Faustus, being tempted, holding forth on stage. And he sees the 7 deadly sins, and that's fine. And he sees Lucifer and the other devil that comes on stage with Lucifer, and that's fine. He sees Mephistopheles, that's fine. And then he sees an extra devil. And he is angry at first. And he shouts, at the other actors when he goes off stage, like, who was that man on my stage? Who was that man? And the other actors all go, well, there was only us. What are you talking about? And the story is, of course, that Alain was so frightened by the idea that a real devil had come onto the stage that he ran out of the theatre and never again performed with a big cross stitched onto his doublet. But you can find that story reproduced again and again. It pops up in central London in 1632. In about 1592, it pops up at a theatre or inn-yard in Exeter, where Faustus was performed. So it's this kind of recurring urban myth / story about the play Faustus. And there's another version of it where what happens is it's during the invocation of Mephistopheles, and there's a crack, and the whole frame of the building, the wooden frame of the building, shifts, and the audience thinks, oh my God, the devil is coming, the devil is coming. They ran out, and the actors are standing there going, oh, we're probably not going to get a tip for this, are we?
Is there one play more than any other, or one piece of work more than any other that has unexplained myths and legends attached to it? I mean, you've talked about Dr. Faustus, whatever that one was, and is there any one that you've come across that exceeds an urban myth or something like that?
Well, now this is annoying to me, by the way, because my brain is failing me, because I'm a social historian who specifically studies kind of the supernatural as a thing understood by citizens of the 16th, 17th century. That's my little tiny niche.
Yeah.
So I'm not a theatre historian, and so this is a story told to me by one of my colleagues at the Globe who is a theatre history person. And basically he was kind of, because we were talking about the curse of the Scottish play.
Uh-huh.
And he was saying that until like the late 18th century, there was a totally different play that was considered the cursed play, and that it had this terrible death rate, and that, actors wouldn't do it, and that sort of thing. And it was a play, it might have been Coriolanus, but I can't remember at all which one it was. And it's a play... Yeah?
I think it is. You're ringing a bell actually saying that, yeah.
Because I think it's Coriolanus, because I remember just thinking, really? Yeah, I think it's Coriolanus, possibly.
Yeah.
And that... Yeah, and it was that play was cursed, and people wouldn't put it on because of that. And it was only in the 19th century the idea of the Scottish playing being cursed really came up. So it's that. I mean, my thing is, I think, sort of edging out of history and into belief in this sort of thing, that especially with ritual magic as portrayed in theatre, it's fairly safe for the simple reason that, yes, words have power, but when you're looking at ritual magic, so many factors have to be right. Ritual magic is in some ways the Formula 1 car of magical practice, because it can reach very high speeds, but with a Formula 1 car, if you just jump in a Formula 1 car and put your foot on the accelerator, what you've done is break millions of pounds worth of equipment. The wheels have to be a certain temperature. Yeah. The track has to be a certain temperature. The car has to be opened up and cycled in about 7 stages before you can move on it. And even then, if you touch the pedals at the wrong angle, you'll destroy the engine. And that's ritual magic. You have to be doing it after the right purifications. You personally have to live the right lifestyle leading up to the ritual. You have to be doing it in the right kind of room with the right astrological stuff going on, or to have done stuff to compensate. There's some interesting stuff in a couple of grimoires about that. I've bought in a massive binge. And so just standing up and speaking the words, are actually within reason fairly safe. but and sort of and other forms of magic I would be hairier about. I mean, if only out of cultural respect as well as a sort of possible magical belief, but out of cultural respect. I went to SOAS, the School of Oriental African Studies, and when I did my unit in African magic and religion, you know, we had this lecturer, Mark Faulkner, who was very big on instilling respect into us. And he was sort of saying that, you know, Africa is not a time machine. And so when you see all these medieval historians who study witchcraft, and sadly, it's a thing you see less often these days, but it still happens now and again. And anthropologists do it as well. And they compare modern Africa with sort of, you know, 14th to 16th century Britain or Europe. And that's not good. But also, you know, I wouldn't be happy with a production that put voodoo on the stage, for example, unless it was done by people who themselves were practitioners and sort of proper of the culture practitioners, if people will forgive me for saying so.
Well, sorry to plug another show in a different... But a friend of mine who is a voodoo practitioner, I've interviewed him, and I'm doing a show on voodoo, and makes a very similar point that we're making here, that there's a very specific way in which you have to work, and a lot of the stuff you see in the media through films and TV is so far from reality that you couldn't put the voodoo on the stage because it's about as real as the Teletubbies, because the way it's done, it's very much based on, again, it's kind of coming back to what we were talking before about the Victorian ideas towards ghosts. A lot of the ideas we have about voodoo now are based around some books written in the 1920s and 30s that are very, very anti and very biased against voodoo practice, and made it seem to be sort of devil worshipping, lots of animal sacrifices, and just misrepresented. And a lot of our modern notions of voodoo are based around those very poor misrepresentations, including something as simple as the voodoo doll, which is an anathema. There's no such thing as a voodoo doll, never was. There is now, because voodoo is adaptive and has taken on board the idea of the voodoo doll, but it's not a traditional voodoo item at all. So, yeah, very much that you have to do these things specifically and properly, otherwise you'll have... it's not just like the medium getting nothing as being the worst that can happen. It can be much more deleterious, shall we say, than that.
Oh, Lordy. Oh, and if I'm talking about adaptive religions and adaptive faith, one story from my Professor Mark Faulkner was wonderful. He, through a series of accidents, he ended up spending quite a long time, like I think it was about a decade, with a culture of people on an island off the coast of Kenya called the Boni. And they weren't a tribe, they were a culture, they were a group, an ethnic group on this island. And he was talking about a living religion because they are sort of local person who did magic, you know, sort of had this particular method of divination. And he did this method of divination. He would sacrifice an animal. He would have this rope made of very stiff, I think it was giraffe hide. And he would soak it in the blood. And part of the feeling of magic was that this totally rigid thing that was almost like wood would then become soft and would become this soft knotted rope. And he would sing and speak, and then he would whirl it above his head, and he would let go, and it would fall in a pattern, and the pattern and where the knots were and the shape it was would mean something. And in the end, by the way, Mark actually learned that, and he showed us his rope for doing it, but obviously the University of London wouldn't let us sacrifice an animal because now the left are in charge of everything. I'm joking, but anyway, but yeah. So you know, they wouldn't let us sacrifice a goat or a chicken or anything, not even a student. And basically, yeah. So we didn't get to see him doing it. But anyway, the story goes that so he was sort of seeing it done for the first time, and he sat and. You know, there was a woman who wanted a divination done about some business stuff for her husband, and so they did that. And afterwards, he spoke to this guy, and he sort of said, so, you know, how long what is that? He said, oh, it's a very ancient ancient form of divination. Oh, so how long has it been in the bony culture? And the guy, without missing a beat, said, 1973. I went over... Yes. And he said, I went over to the mainland and I swapped it for a pair of shoes with the guy on the other side, because what I was using at the time was just useless.
Brilliant.
And...
you have to start somewhere.
Well, exactly. And obviously there was some guy on the mainland who had that form of divination. And the guy from Lamu, the island the Bony lived on, he just, he went across and he had a pair of shoes of whatever type, and he learned it of the trade that way. And, and that was the thing. And another story that I was told on that course was, the sort of the chap that he stayed with while he was sort of getting his own home together there, was a Muslim imam. But when his wife got sick, he still went out into the yard behind the house and he still sacrificed to the ancestors. And they had sort of synthesized in their particular vision of how Islam worked that just the Prophet was the greatest ancestor. And, he was the greatest ancestor of them all, but they still understood him to some extent within an ancestor worship framework.
Absolutely. It is one of the oldest faiths, of course, of any kind. It is ancestor worship. When you go back to the real origins of a lot of, even modern religion, really, that ancestor worship plays a big part. And going back quickly to the voodoo thing, and that's probably the most adaptable or adaptive magical practice there is. It does absorb all sorts of things from other places and cultures that come into it. It's not rigidly as structured as anything as most other systems of magic can be. Although that said, if you're working particularly with specific loa, which are the voodoo spirits, you do have to work in a particular way and have to do the right kind of thing. But you can, as we were saying earlier on as well, you almost generate your own loa, your own spirits, and then how you work that spirit is up to you.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
I'll let you know when the interview goes out. So.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Very interesting. It is one of the things that fascinates me because, yes, living adaptive religions, and it is one of the things about the modern world of magical practice that very slightly worries me. Because there are some schools who are obsessed with the idea of tradition and digging back to this very old form of things. And it reminds me of what happened to the Latin language. Because what happened to the Latin language is medieval Latin is very living and adaptive, and it's very easy to use and easy to read. And then in about 15th, 16th century, they got this bug in their heads that classical Latin was better. And so what they did is, instead of just going back to classical Latin, they made this rarefied, super complex thing called Neo-Latin, which basically was kind of like everything was like Cicero. Because Cicero's orations in Latin are really complex, and that's supposed to show how unbelievably smart he is. And there is a sort of line, I don't know if it's a classical quote or if it's something said by a classicist, that not even Cicero actually spoke or wrote like Cicero when he was not writing those orations. But they wanted everybody to be Cicero. And they kind of killed the Latin language to some extent because they made it so rarefied and complex that people went to the English language. And they went to vernacular languages just because, it started off, of course, you'd only keep your accounts in English. You wouldn't do anything important in English. But then that vernacular convenience ate away. It's the one thing where I love the grimoire tradition. I hope it'll be able to be a living tradition, though.
Well, it's going to continue very much, as you know, and I'm going to have to plug myself. I have to do, as you know, John. Mysterian Press. You know all about it. It's already that my plan is to reproduce some hitherto neglected grimoires, at least editions of grimoires, because most of them are already available, but there are variations within that aren't available. Most of them are either available as bloody awful paperbacks, which are like print on demand type things, or create space from Amazon, or ultra expensive older editions that are in leather bound form. And I'm intending to reprint most of them in relatively inexpensive cloth bound editions that people can actually get hold of and actually make use of, as well as the idea that they're being once again used as practical magic. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. I'm going to play devil's advocate on this one, because I do think that a lot of these traditions within magic need to be preserved and done properly for the very reasons we were just talking about. But also, it's to put off the dabbler, the person who wants to fiddle about, not really learn what they're doing, and just sort of do a few bits and pieces, and then find, well, either A, it goes completely awry, or B, more than likely, nothing happens. So the people that want to preserve those kind of traditions, I agree with, but also it needs to develop. It does need to grow. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't, because we grow and develop, society grows and develops, and our minds grow and develop, so there can be changes. And I'm very much a believer that we're not dealing with demons, in quotation marks, the classic description of these forces. The division between angel and demon, as you well know, is a relatively modern concept, and if you go further back, there's no such division at all. There's no such description of being of particular kinds. There are changes, there are developments, and different kinds of energies and entities you're working with, and they aren't all the same. So I sort of sit on both sides of that argument. I'd like to think that tradition should be preserved because of the importance of it should be followed properly, but it does put off those who want to just dabble and fiddle about. But on the other hand, it does need to grow and develop, because it has undoubtedly grown and developed over the centuries anyway. New grimoires have popped up. Most of them tend to try to claim to be medieval or earlier. In actual fact, they're probably in the last 50 years or so prior to their existence. But, things like, a good example would be the Grimoire of Turiel, which supposedly appeared in 1910 and was the very first ever seen in print, and that dates from that date. But Frederick Hockley, one of the founding minds behind the Golden Dawn, who passed on before the Golden Dawn formed, Titan Press have pre-printed most of his own personal material, including handwritten grimoires. And there is sections in one of the grimoires that are remarkably like the Grimoire of Turiel, which would put that back to the mid-1800s, so at least 60 years before it was thought to originated. So it is interesting that when you think you've got a relative construction, in actual fact, it may well be based on something else that is older. In fact, it's very, very close to the Grimoire of Turiel. So it's really quite interesting that there is still the ideas to grow and develop, but they may still be older than we actually thought.
I like that. I've got a copy of the Grimoire of Turiel, actually.
Okay.
But I must admit, I've got one off the CD of the wonderful Twilight Grotto site.
Oh yes, Joseph Peterson stuff, fantastic.
Yeah, because I bought the CD of that. In fact, I should probably buy another one, because I know how much extra stuff there is on there since I bought it.
I'll put this one. I've gone to DVD rather than CD. There's so much more on it.
Oh my god, that's fantastic! But yeah, and so I've got a version of the Grimoire of Turiel, and I love that. And I even actually quite like people saying it's medieval, because you know what? That's authentic too. I mean, look at all the books of Solomon. I'm not an expert, but I think like the earliest book of Solomon you see is like 1500 something, and yet it claims to be ancient.
Well, the very, very earliest is the Testament of Solomon, which of course names demons, but although despite being supposedly from Solomon himself, it probably goes back to the 3rd century AD. That's probably the oldest one, but that is just names of demons and an idea of what they're capable of doing, which he then uses, obviously, their powers to build the Temple of Solomon. But the idea of specific demons with specific powers only really pops up at the very end of the 1400s, of course. And then actually to the show this as well some time back, but there's a sudden proliferation of these grimoires because they appear to have power, they appear to have spells which are effective. You've got the emergence of the very, very cheap print in the chapter books, which of course is the first chapter, which are very, very cheap. So there's a proliferation of those all over the place. People want power because they feel powerless, and sort of the power around them of the sort of government, etc., is so vast that they can't fight against it. So they turn to magical practices to fight against it. Obviously, often they don't have recourse to the police if things go wrong, because there aren't any police. So they try and use magic against their enemies or people who might have wronged them. So there's a massive explosion of these documents all around about that same time. But there is... historically speaking, there is always this notion of you have to predate these things. So if we have a grimoire today that we say is from medieval times, like, wow, that's ancient. But you go back to medieval times, it would be modern. So they'll go back to Solomon's time and say it's much more older. It goes back to the ancient Solomon tradition of, a few thousand years before. So there's always this notion of you have to make these things have ancient heritage and ancient pedigree before you're going to take them seriously. But as we were just saying, these things have to start somewhere. So,
totally, man. Well, interestingly, that takes me to literally one of the most common things I say to little children on my tour of the globe, because they always ask me, why is it round? And I have to sort of explain to them, well, the thing is, right, the ancient Greeks and Romans had these round amphitheatres. And, we look back at Shakespeare and think that he was this amazing, cool dude. Well, I do. I don't get out much. But, we think he was this super smart guy and this great artist. And that this time was romantic and cool and full of sword fights and that sort of thing. But they were living in it, so they didn't think it was special at all. And in 400 years, people will look at our time and think that. And so for them, the special time, as you say, was the classical period. And so, they built their bear baiting arenas. Let's make it like an arena from the Romans. But, we don't have tons of good stone to use, so let's make it a timber frame. And from there goes theatre. Uh-huh. And so, that sort of takes me back to that. No, I think it's quite natural and to be honest, quite cool that people are backdating their grimoires. I'll even forgive people who claim ancient magician authorship for the simple reason that, the fourth book of Agrippa, I believe, isn't actually sort of Agrippa. It's much later.
Yeah. No. Well, what
Gentlemen, sorry, I'm so sorry to cut in because we are actually at the end of the show, believe it or not. And you guys could talk all night if we carried on. I had trouble finding a gap there to butt in. Now, John, before we go, you have written a new book, haven't you? An occult cyber punk book. It's a work of fiction, I believe.
Yes, absolutely. It is the far future of a world where magic is real. And so, it's about 3,500 years in our future, but it is a world where all of these paths, they do actually work. And so there is a character in it who is a hermetic ritual magician. It involves fairies of the type we've been discussing here, and sort of two characters, one of whom is sort of an ex-soldier and she is quite badly disabled, and there you have another who's a kind of vain middle-aged narcissist, and they both end up back in the city where they made their career as sort of gangsters, trying to sort of have each one last job to sort out all their financial problems.
And am I right in thinking it's called A Dark Neon Dying?
That is it, absolutely.
And where can we find this book to buy if we would like to get it?
Oh, you can find it in a variety of places. You can find it on Amazon. John Kanecko James, The Dark Neon Dying on Amazon.com, available for Kindle. You can also find it on the website Other Side Books. And if you buy it on Amazon, I think it's about £4.60. If you buy it on Other Side Books, you can get it directly to your email, and it only costs you $2.99. And Other Side Books will pay tax on it. But also, it's a great thing. There will be a print edition later in the year. But if you want it now, you can get it for Kindle on either Other Side Books or Amazon.
That's fantastic. And where else can people find you, John, if they want to get in contact with you on anything we've discussed tonight?
They can find me through my website, johnkaneckojames.com. I'm on Twitter as John KJ Writer. And just let me check something, because I have a work page. And the address of my work sort of Facebook page is www.facebook.com/JohnKJWriter/ and that's all one word. And so that's where they can get in touch with me, and I'm always very happy to hear from people.
Lovely. Thank you so much for talking to us tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating. I don't think I've ever been so quiet through an interview. I've been absolutely fascinated by everything you've been talking about, and I'd love to talk to you again at some point.
Oh, I'd be very happy to come back. I've had a lovely time. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And thank you, Andy, as always.
Yes, quite.
Yes, good to have a chat, Andy and Kerry. Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for listening. You can catch up with all of our shows on podcast, through Spreaker, or on YouTube. And for that, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I found it absolutely fascinating. Thank you all for listening. And don't forget, we have shows every night of the week next week. So I bid you a farewell and good night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.